Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with Dr. Patrick Colm Hogan. He is Distinguished Professor of the Department of English and the Institute for Brain and Cognitive Sciences at the University of Connecticut in the US. His specialties are literary theory, cognitive and affective science of literature, and world literature. He is the author of several books, including The Mind and Its Stories, What Literature Teaches Us About Emotion, and Beauty and Sublimity. So, Dr. Colm Hogan, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Okay, so the first thing I would like to ask you, and I think that it is very important for people to get a good grasp of this concept because it is very central for today's discussion. Because we're talking about literary universals and aesthetic universals, to talk about these, I mean, we include knowledge from several areas, including psychology, anthropology, and also, of course, the humanities. So, what are basically human universals?
There are different phrases used for this general area of study. Human universals is one, cultural universals, more specific terms such as linguistic or literary universals, and they have slightly different usages. Human universals and cultural universals are generally used, not uniformly, but generally used to refer to patterns that recur across all cultures and traditions. Linguistic universals and literary universals, those phrases are used more broadly to cover patterns that recur across what are called genetically and areally distinct traditions or cultures with a greater frequency than would be expected by chance. So in the terminology of linguistics, human or cultural universals, those phrases are usually used to refer to what linguists, or what I, in discussing literary universals, would refer to as absolute universals, or sometimes near absolute universals, patterns that recur across almost all cultures or traditions. Whereas a literary and linguistic study of universals would include what are called statistical and implicational universals. Statistical universals are, as I say, those that they may recur. Suppose by chance you would expect, take a linguistic example, head complement relations in a phrase. You would, since they can go either head first or head last, you would take the specific example of subjects and objects. Since they can go either subject-object or object-subject, they can go in those two orders. By chance, you would expect them to recur roughly 50% subject-object and 50% object-subject. Well, in fact, across languages, it does sometimes happen that you get object-subject as normal word order, but it's extremely rare. So it's considered a statistical universal with a high degree of probability that you'll get subject-object order. The basic difference for those distinctions in terminology would be that there'd be basically two. First of all, if you're interested only in absolute universals, you're probably going to look almost entirely to evolutionary explanations. Now, in fact, you can get an absolute universal without it being fully determined by evolutionary precedents, because there are many other things that recur across cultures, and we'll probably get to some of those in the course of the conversation. But it tends to be the case that people look to evolution. Now, evolution is certainly important in looking at statistical universals, but you're also more likely to look at other factors, sometimes factors about the physical universe, the things that we encounter in the world, sometimes factors having to do with group dynamics, the way that groups tend to interact, sometimes complex systems analyses, just the way that complex systems tend to work, and so on. So that'd be the basic and so to give a very brief example, and when I discuss narrative universals, patterns in narrative that recur cross-culturally, whether they recur in all traditions or only in a surprisingly large number of them, a statistically significantly larger number than would be expected, either way, I have a whole range of things that go into explaining them. They aren't determined. They aren't simply adaptive. They aren't simply the product of genetic evolution.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And we'll get into some of those later.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sure. And it's very interesting that you distinguished between absolute and statistical universals, because that means that for us to consider something as a human universal, it doesn't really have to occur 100% of the time in all existing or studied human cultures, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some people are unhappy with the word universal when applied in that context, and I can understand that. If we wanted to, we could refer to them as cross-cultural patterns or something like that. I use the word universal because I use as my model linguistics, the study of linguistics, and that's the way it's used traditionally there. I can understand people's qualms about it, but the reason for making that one continuous category is not to mask the differences. Certainly there are differences between things that recur in all cultures and things that recur in, say, 70% of cultures, even though you might expect them to recur in 20 or some 20%. There's certainly a difference there. But in pursuing a research program on cross-cultural patterns or universals, you want to recognize the continuity that places some patterns in broad distributions around the globe without interaction of the traditions. And that, I mentioned before, genetically and areally distinct, that's what that means. Genetically distinct means they have different origins. Not genetic in that sense is refers to genesis, not to chromosomes. So genetically distinct and areally distinct means they haven't influenced one another extensively later on. So you want this part of a continuous research, all of these different patterns part of a continuous research program, so that you're looking for, as you're in your research program, you're looking for explanations that will further your understanding of both what recurs cross-culturally and what can vary. And so ideally you'd have a hierarchy of explanatory principles that would tell you why this pattern recurs 100% of the time, this one 90% of the time, and so on, and would also tell you what the relations among them are. So that something that recurs 100% of the time will presumably be one part of the explanation for things that recur, specifications of that general pattern that recur less frequently.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's also very interesting because for us to determine what are human universals, and the list of them, of course, we can resort to a multitude of different disciplines, including psychology, anthropology, neuroscience, and also the humanities in terms of analyzing some types of sources like the arts and texts and things like that. So, I mean, in order for us to determine what are the human universals, being them absolute or only statistical, it functions as a sort of network of cumulative evidence from several different disciplines and sources, correct?
Absolutely. I might, since I found out yesterday I can share a screen here, I might just show you, I mean, I think you've seen it, but the Literary Universals Project, is that up on your screen now? Mm-hmm. This is a project that Vito Evola and Nigel Fabb and I initiated. It's housed at the University of Connecticut. It's a website that publishes articles on different aspects of literary universal study. It includes, for example, an article by Donald Brown on human universals. Donald Brown being one of the, maybe the major anthropologist writing on that topic, who's written on that topic. And the point of having a center for research, it isn't a center, that makes it sound like it's an institution, a central place where research can be funneled. The idea of it is that you need people from many different disciplines, and also even within a given discipline, many different subfields. So if you're going to discuss certain aspects of literary universals, most of the things that I discuss are fairly general patterns of narrative structure. And for that, you can largely rely on translations, because translations can be, unless the translator has made a decision to change the story can be pretty easily preserved from the original to the translation. But there are other things that you need to know the language for. So if you're discussing image patterns, for example, image patterns aren't preserved across translations. So you need people who know, if you're going to look at image patterns or whatever, anything that's more textually ingrained, more textually defined or specified. You need people to compare Chinese and Kinyarwanda and Arabic and English. You need people who know Chinese and Kinyarwanda and Arabic and English. So that's the purpose of something like the Literary Universals Project. The other aspect to let me switch back to the, stop sharing. So the other aspect of the interdisciplinarity that you mentioned is that it has to enter into even individual research programs. So we might get to later some discussion of aesthetics. I think we will, because you've indicated a number of things you're going to ask about that. When I first began researching, trying to formulate an account of aesthetic response, I isolated a couple of different, there were a couple of different bodies of research that pointed towards distinct information processing aspects of aesthetic pleasure. And once I had two, I had the question of why would you have two? Is there some pattern to that? That was already relying on empirical research. But when I tried to figure out why there were two, it struck me that these two were two of three prominent ways of defining conceptual categories. This therefore suggested that the third way of defining a conceptual category might have aesthetic effects also, which is what I turn to next. And we can give examples of that later on, assuming we get to it. Or when you mentioned the mind and its stories, when I was doing research work for the mind and its stories, I simply read across a wide range of genetically and aerially unrelated traditions. And I was just actually doing that without a project in mind, and I began to notice these patterns across stories. And as I formulated them, I began reading other traditions that I hadn't read more systematically. Once I had formulated a couple of the heroic and romantic patterns that I saw recurring across a range of traditions, I sought to find a body of literature, or in this case, orature, mostly orature, that I hadn't consulted before, Ainu storytelling, and read a number of works in that, which largely seems to me to corroborate what I had said. But there were also stories in there that seemed to form other patterns, which I then took up as part of the research project, going back to the traditions I had investigated initially. So these are two examples of the way that this multiplicity, either multiplicity within literature itself or multiplicity across empirical disciplines outside of literature, that multiplicity has to continually be refolded into an ongoing research program.
Mhm. Okay, very well. So let's now dig a little bit more into aesthetic human universals. You already alluded a little bit to them earlier in the conversation. But okay, so should we start off by perhaps talking about the evolutionary basis of them? Because I mean, I guess that the evolutionary basis is not yet very well established, because there are several hypotheses, I think, and of course it also depends on what we're talking about, because I guess that if we're talking about for example, beauty, what we consider beautiful when we look at other people, perhaps we would have to resort to things related to sexual selection, and perhaps what gets expressed in terms of the phenotype that is a proxy to good genes in both men and women. But perhaps if we're talking about more things related to nature, perhaps then we can talk about the savanna hypothesis that some people put on the table, that perhaps what we like to see in terms of paintings and I mean visually, aesthetically, is what we were exposed to in the environments that we evolved in, and in this particular case, the savanna. That is an open space where we can get a wide range of vision to see if there are predators coming close by, and also to be able to get a look at the prey that we want to capture and things like that. But basically, the environment we evolved in and that our brains were exposed to and were adapted to, let's say, to deal with that specific environment. But I mean, there are a lot of things on the table. So could you please help us here by trying to refer to what are the important aspects to consider here in what pertains to the evolutionary basis of aesthetic universals? And I already talked a little bit about beauty. Perhaps that's a different subject, but if you could do it, please.
Right. Well, this is really interesting because you had said before you would ask something along those general lines, but you hadn't given the examples of human beauty with preferable genetic background exemplified in a phenotype, nor had you given the example of landscape. And when I was thinking about answering the more general question you brought up, I could even show it to you. I had jotted down that I could begin by mentioning landscape and something a little more specific, but the same general idea as your comments on human beauty, which is facial symmetry. The reason I would have brought both of those up, and the reason you brought both of them up, the reason we converged on that, is that those are two standard examples of an evolutionary hypothesis with regard to aesthetics. I actually differ from most people who discuss beauty in evolutionary terms in that I think beauty should be explained by more general principles which are themselves adaptive. In some cases, the adaptive function of those more general principles may indeed have been influenced by their specification in, say, facial symmetry, human facial symmetry. That may have contributed functionally to the evolution of aesthetics, but it isn't the evolutionary principles are not specific to those two cases. So take facial symmetry. And the same thing applies to body left-right symmetry. My argument, as you know, from Beauty and Sublimity, is that empirically there are a range of things that seem to foster aesthetic pleasure, our aesthetic response to anything. Trees, objects of use, tools, human beings, the way rooms are set up. I was recently watching The East is Red, a 1965 propaganda film from the People's Republic of China, which is kind of crazy politically. All praise to our great leader Mao Zedong and so on, but is visually stunning. It's just gorgeous. And I think in all of these cases, the same information processing and emotion processing aspects recur. So what about facial symmetry then? Well, my contention is that there's this large body of research that indicates what I call prototype approximation is a contributory factor to us responding with aesthetic pleasure to a target. Prototype approximation is roughly averaging across experienced instances, but with a what Ramachandran calls peak shift. It's a bias toward difference based on how you categorize the target. So a good example, I'm going to show you something from not anything that I've done. It's let me see. My current slide. This is this website, faceresearch.org. It's fun to play with, so people might like to know about it. So the program will take various faces. You can click on various faces. We'll click on her. Click on her. Click on her. Let's click on her. So I'm perfectly fine looking people. I'm certainly not going to criticize them, but you average them, and generally people say the composite that averages across the different contributory faces is more aesthetically pleasing than any of the contributing faces considered on their own. So why is that? Well, the more faces you average, the closer you come to a prototype. Again, a prototype being roughly an average. Now, I did all women there because one of our most salient and forceful forms of categorization is by gender. And so in Richard Russell's research, for example, Richard Russell studied, this is from an article of his, which you might even know. Russell manipulated facial luminance differences within portraits of men and women. And men and women start out with slight differences in facial luminance, so that there tends to be a greater circumocular versus the rest of the face luminance for women. That for women tends to be greater. And similarly, the lips versus the rest of the face tends to be a starker contrast for women than for men. And so Russell manipulated these facial luminance differences and asked people to judge the faces aesthetically, and found that if you increased facial luminance on male faces, that decreased the judgment of aesthetic pleasure, whereas if you increased them on female faces, it increased the aesthetic pleasure. So in keeping with a difference that was, in other words, if you enhance the category-based difference, you increase the aesthetic pleasure. If you diminish or reverse the category-based difference, you diminish the aesthetic pleasure. So the reason I emphasize this is all explicable by reference to prototype approximation. None of it has to be specifically selected for in sexual terms. Now, this isn't to say that mate selection doesn't contribute to prototype approximation, but prototype approximation would presumably affect everything. It would affect our response to trees, our response to fruit, our response to vegetables, a whole range of things. We'd have preference for prototype approximation, and that's also true as the result of that mechanism. We don't confine our aesthetic response to mates. Our aesthetic response is related to a whole series of, is evoked by a whole series of other phenomena. I probably should pause there. As you know, I have other factors contributing to aesthetic response that are not prototype based. There are, in terms of information processing, there are some targets that do not lend themselves well to prototype approximation, and in those cases we tend to respond aesthetically in terms of rule abstraction. If we're able to isolate a rule-governed pattern without habituating to it. In other words, it hasn't become ordinary. Actually, before stopping, I should say that the non-habituation principle applies to prototyping too, because just as a general rule, we respond less to things we're habituated to. That's what habituation means. Actually, let me close this and switch back to me. We respond less to things that we habituate to, and in consequence, whether it's negative or positive, we don't have a strong response to it. So things that are habitual are no longer aesthetically consequential properties. So you average across faces, and the average you come up with will have 2 eyes and 1 nose. We don't count having 2 eyes and 1 nose as an aesthetically consequential property. I just realized I forgot something. I brought up facial symmetry at the beginning and bodily symmetry, and I never got back to symmetry in particular. Mm-hmm. Symmetry results automatically from prototype approximation. As you average across faces, people's faces, some people's faces will be asymmetrical with a left side bias and some with a right side bias, and you average across many faces, and we see many, many faces in daily life. As you average across them, you automatically get a prototype that is left-right symmetrical. So left-right symmetry comes out of prototype approximation just as a given. That's something that's going to happen when you have prototype approximation. Mm-hmm. So an elegant explanation for that, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes, right. And I want to add a follow-up to that, because since we're talking about the... of course, you didn't limit yourself to the evolutionary basis of beauty and aesthetics, or human beauty and human aesthetics in this case, but I would also like to ask you again, referring to evolution, if you think that there's good evidence that supports the hypothesis put forth by people like Geoffrey Miller and Steven Pinker, that perhaps artistic behavior was also one of the targets of sexual selection.
Yeah, I'm just not convinced that the bowerbird has anything to do with aesthetics. Sure, there might be some contribution, but I tend to think that aesthetic response is principally a function of, in cognitive terms, prototype approximation and rule abstraction, which are well established as evolutionary products. I mean, clearly our ability to abstract unexpected rules, to isolate new patterns, it's one of the most fundamental cognitive processes we have. And the idea that this would give us pleasure when we were able to abstract principles from experience is, I think basically no one who accepts anything evolutionary would reject that. I don't think, I mean, that seems that we all agree on that. Similarly, prototype approximation is a little more controversial because some people don't accept prototypes. They think we sort of ad hoc generalize on the basis of exemplars. That seems to me enormously unlikely because it basically says every time we generalize, we just rid the brain of whatever we generalized. It just disappears. And we go back to where we were with the exemplars beforehand. That seems extremely unlikely. I do think exemplars are important, but I don't think that they eliminate prototypes. Anyway, that's a little more controversial, but I think is fairly well established. I add to that emotional aspects of aesthetic response, and these would include not interest, which is sort of the converse of non-habituation. You haven't habituated, so you maintain attentional orientation toward the target. Some sort of reward system involvement. The reward system in this case having two components, the opioid component relating to the experience of pleasure and the dopaminergic system component relating to basically the urge to continue on in a process of engagement. Seeking is what Panksepp calls the system for that reason. Those are important. Those, however, are basically important to any sort of activity. If you're going to do anything, you need some sort of interest and some sort of, in other words, non-habituation, and some sort of reward system involvement, or you're probably not going to do it, whether it's reading a book or digging a ditch or exercising or whatever. One thing that seems to be more distinctive of aesthetic response is attachment system involvement. And again, attachment clearly did not evolve for aesthetic reasons. It evolved for childbearing, child raising, parent-child bonding, and so on. But there's a lot of evidence, even though weirdly the evidence hasn't been formulated in terms of attachment system, there's a lot of evidence that attachment response is very important to aesthetic feeling. As I discussed in Beauty and Sublimity, there's research indicating that one finds faces in general more attractive, more beautiful when one's oxytocin levels have been increased. So those are the factors that seem to me crucial to aesthetic pleasure. And as such, they are certainly evolved. And in some cases, aesthetic response may have contributed to the evolution. So I'm not saying the aesthetic feelings are irrelevant. They can be relevant, but they're not processes narrowly tailored to aesthetics. The second thing I would mention is in connection with this, some researchers seem to think that there's something particularly male about at least certain forms of aesthetics, and that seems to me misguided. In terms of the processes I've mentioned, I see no reason to think that. Well, I could imagine somebody arguing that because of their role in childbearing, women might be more attachment sensitive than men are. I hope that is not the case. I certainly would not want to say that it's the case, but I could imagine an argument in that direction. But I see nothing in the system that I've defined that would favor males. So my whole system goes in a somewhat different direction. What to do about the bowerbird? I don't know. I'm just not inclined to, or the peacock's tail. I'm just not inclined to, even though yes, peacock's tail is beautiful. We respond to it as beauty, in part because it's non-habitual patterning. But I don't see those as sources of aesthetic response, even though they can be targets of aesthetic response.
Mm-hmm. Very well. Okay, so now let's see if I can articulate this question properly, because it's a very difficult one, and this came to my mind from all that you just exposed, let's say. That is, so you refer to the fact that there are very many factors that go into our experience of aesthetics and beauty and all of those things, and even more generally our artistic expressions and things like that. But so there are some factors that perhaps some people would classify as socio-cultural ones, like, for example, the fact that something is popular, the fact that something is held in high regard by people who hold status in a particular society, perhaps things also related to conspicuous consumption, because sometimes we appreciate some things aesthetically, not really because of their intrinsic value, but because they signal something else related to social aspects and to our position in the social hierarchy and things like that. So, but even those, they have a biological basis to them, because I mean the ways we socialize with people also have a lot to do with our ability to survive, because it was really important for us during our evolutionary history that we cooperated with other people, because I mean we as humans by ourselves, we are not that good predator or something like that to be able to survive and to reproduce in our own. So that is one aspect of my question. The other aspect is, so having all of this in mind, and perhaps these social influences that also go into how we experience beauty and aesthetics and how we report those experiences, couldn't it also be the case that perhaps sometimes there's a mismatch between what people really experience as being beautiful and what they report to other people that they experience as being beautiful, just because perhaps they have one experience, but since it doesn't go along with what is considered proper experience, let's say, in the society that they are part of, then perhaps there's that's a confounding factor when we're doing studies on human aesthetic preferences. I mean, do all of these make sense or not?
Oh, absolutely. An excellent question. There are three things that I would say about it. I hope I will remember all three when I get to the end. The first one is, in beauty and sublimity, I make a general distinction between what I call social beauty and aesthetic response. And social beauty is a sort of competence we have to say what people in general are going to judge as beautiful. This is more general than beauty. We have a whole range of social judgments that bear not only on beauty and sublimity, literary excellence, artistic excellence, profundity. There are a lot of things that are widely considered profound, things in literary theory that are widely considered profound in my profession that I think are just fake. But I don't know the degree to which people genuinely feel they're profound, but you're sort of not competent in the field if you don't know that people think they're profound. So on the one hand, there are judgments of what people will say is beautiful. That's what I call social beauty. on the other hand, is aesthetic response what you actually respond to aesthetically. And so anyway, and now I've forgotten what I was talking about. Aesthetic response. So that I usually use the example of somebody might say something like, well, I know my baby isn't much to look at, but to me, she's the most beautiful thing in the world. And they could be speaking hyperbolically, but they might well mean it. They might mean that there's nothing that gives me greater aesthetic pleasure than looking at this slimy fish-like newborn that anybody else would go bleh to because of attachment system involvement. I mean, that's a sort of extreme example. But so on the one hand, this is pervasive. Our judgments of social beauty can be wildly at odds with our personal aesthetic response. Now, to what extent, the two other points are, one has to do with empirical research, which you sort of brought up at the end. Isn't it a confounding factor? And yes, it can be. And I think even though I've relied on research in aesthetics, it varies very widely in the way the questions are formulated and the degree to which these sorts of variables are controlled for. And there are some experiments I discussed briefly. It isn't at all a focus of beauty and sublimity, but I discussed briefly a couple of experiments that show the degree to which the phrasing of a survey can be can make a study basically worthless, because what the test subjects are asked is so vague, is so amorphous, is so unclear that you don't have any idea what anyway. So that can be a problem. All that I can say is, just like any other research program, as you formulate possible explanations, that will refine your empirical methodology, and hopefully these sorts of distinctions would be taken into account more fully in further studies. I've had, for example, productive interchanges with Anjan Chatterjee on this, and I don't know if he might. I mean, I don't do that sort of lab research myself. That'd have to be someone else. But I don't know if he might do laboratory research that takes into account those sorts of distinctions, perhaps. But as I say, I felt that I've had good interchange with him on these issues. The third thing is so we have the distinction between social beauty, judgments of social beauty, and aesthetic response. And we have the issue of confounding variables, especially these two, the distinction between social beauty and aesthetic response in empirical research. The third is the issue of the degree to which social prestige actually influences our aesthetic response. And there are some simple ways in which it does that. So one simple way in which it does that is that it leads us to question if we have a judgment that is out of keeping with those of other people generally in terms of popularity, or those of people we consider experts, people to whom we grant prestige. If we have a response that's out of keeping with what we take to be their responses, that can motivate us to distrust our initial response, which can be a good thing. I think in literary study, somebody might encounter complicated modernist work, Joyce's Ulysses, Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, or Sound and the Fury, Virginia Woolf's Interior Monologue and Stream of Consciousness work, might begin it and say, I had a student, for example, who read Mrs. Dalloway, which I think is one of the most beautiful works ever written. And it just, he hated it. And my judgment, the fact that he had to read it for the class, his and my discussions of it and discussions of what to look for changed his response to it entirely, so that by the end of the semester he loved the book. He too felt it was really beautiful. And I think in cases like that, that sort of self-questioning is valuable. Of course, it can also lead to other problems. It can lead to body dysmorphia when you have social standards that you readjust your mind to, and therefore think that you have to look anorexic, or if you're a man, you have to look like Mr. Atlas or something. So it can be problematic too. So in any case, I think one route it goes by, the influence of social judgment on actual response, one route that proceeds by is through self-questioning, self-criticism, and re-examining the target and maybe sensitizing yourself to things in the target that you weren't sensitive to before. However, it seems to also have more immediate impact. And I suspect that has something to do with one's initial emotional stance, the emotional orientation that one has toward the object to begin with. Famous studies show that not only do people, say you have people tasting wine, it isn't exactly the same thing. It's a judgment of pleasure, but whether it's an aesthetic, judgment of aesthetic beauty or not, it's hard to say. But people tasting wine, when they're told different things about the same wine, they not only overtly judge it differently, but they show greater pleasure neurologically to the wine that has been labeled more prestigious than to the same wine labeled as less prestigious. And I don't have a good explanation for that. Where I personally would look first would be to something like prior emotional orientation, because our emotional orientation either towards persons or towards objects greatly affects our emotional response to them. And this is true across a wide range of, it's not just true aesthetically. It's true, for example, in interracial relations, for example. There are these famous studies where you have two actors, one white, one black, and you have them do putatively exactly the same thing. One of them shoves the other playfully. And you have white test subjects who say, when the white guy shoves the black guy playfully, say, oh, he's shoving him playfully. And when the black guy shoves the white guy playfully, they say, ooh, he's being aggressive. And it's clearly a function of what their prior emotional stance was. So that again, is part of my attempt to find broad explanatory principles that apply in specific cases and aren't particular to aesthetics. Mm-hmm. So excellent question.